There is much to talk about, so let's get right to it. Joining us here in Washington is Matthew Cottee. He is a research associate focusing on non-proliferation and nuclear policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. With us from Beijing is Tong Zhao. He is an associate with the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. And Debra Decker is a senior advisor with the Stimson Center's Managing Across Boundaries initiative and the founder of her own firm, focusing on nuclear security and risk management. She joins us here in the studio. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Debra, let me start with you. So we have all these world leaders here in Washington talking about nuclear security. What is the situation right now? How vulnerable are we?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. There's nuclear security in terms of the weapons that are out there that the states hold, and then there's the fissile material that also is in possession of civilian nuclear civilian reactors and research reactors and the radioactive material. So really there's the military possession and the civilian possession. You really have to look at them separately. The military stuff is pretty well locked down, but even in the United States we've had terrible accidents where we've had nuclear bombs go over the United States in planes that the Air Force wasn't even aware of. So that's one major concern that has not really been addressed at this summit to a large extent, and that's something that the non-governmental organizations have been somewhat crying about. 83% of the fissile material is in these weapons, and we're not addressing them. The rest of the material, and there's a lot out there, that's in civilian use, is being addressed. And to your question of how much needs to be done, a lot needs to be done. We are somewhat vulnerable. The threat is so heightened, as we've seen in Belgium and with ISIS, and the consequences are great. There are no international binding standards. And as Nathan King was reporting, the CPPNM amendment coming into force will be great. But even still, those are very high-level standards, like have a nuclear security culture. Well, what does that mean? And implementing it, there's no timeline. So there's a lot to be done.
Right, but I am surprised to hear that there are not more stringent controls over the movement of military weapons in this country. One would have thought that, you know, those things would be under very strict control.
One would have thought. As I heard some person say, we can have little codes on oranges when we go to the checkout counter, right, and we can keep track of that. We can't keep track of our military weapons or our radioactive material. It doesn't make sense.
Well, let's go to Beijing. Let's go to Tong Zhao. Well, we have this meeting taking place here in the United States. They're working together, the United States and China, on nuclear security. Now, the Nuclear Center for Excellence was recently opened in Beijing. Let's listen to what the U.S. Undersecretary of State Rose Gottemoeller had to say about it. Let's watch this.
This was not the United States. This was China taking the lead in making this very important decision, and we were delighted to join together in partnership with Beijing to bring this Center of Excellence to fruition. And it will prove, I'm sure, to be a very important instrument for training not only Chinese experts, but also experts across the region and around the world in the very, very important responsibilities of keeping nuclear materials safe and keeping radiological materials safe and secure from theft.
So, Tong, what specifically will this center be doing, and how else will China and the United States work, on the one hand, to avert nuclear terror, on the other, to improve security?
Well, this center represents a very good example of US-China cooperation to promote international cooperation on nuclear security. The center is the largest one in the Asia-Pacific region. It is where joint research on developing advanced nuclear security technology can take place. And this is where Chinese and Americans can work together to not only train Chinese nuclear security personnel, but also to train nuclear security personnel from other countries in the region. And also, US and China are cooperating to minimize the use of highly enriched uranium to help converting research reactors that use HEU to using low enriched uranium. So I think it's a very good development that the biggest nuclear civilian energy countries in the world are really on the same page here to counter the threat of nuclear terrorism. The world will benefit from the two countries working more closely together in the future.
Matthew, if we look across the world, as I mentioned at the outset, there are 30 countries with nuclear materials, 9 have nuclear weapons. Are there certain parts of the world where the security system is a lot weaker than others?
Sure. I think there are huge regional disparities in terms of how nuclear security is perceived and addressed. We'd like to think that in Europe and North America that nuclear security standards are up to scratch and they're the leaders in this field. But I mean, I think if you look at particularly areas of South Asia, for example, I know that Pakistan has been a major concern for the US administration. They put a lot of effort into trying to bring standards up to scratch in Pakistan. I think to a relatively good standard now, but there are still concerns that remain. And as you mentioned, in terms of weapon ownership, Pakistan is one of the members of that club.
Right.
And there are tactical nuclear weapons in Pakistan, which are the shorter range nuclear weapons. And there are still severe concerns within, particularly the US administration, that these weapons are more prone to theft than perhaps other military materials around the world.
Right. There was a Harvard University report that came out that did say that very thing, that the risk of nuclear theft in Pakistan appears to be very high. That report also said that India's nuclear security measures may be weaker than those of Pakistan.
Yeah, it's a very controversial issue, given the local rivalries, and neither country is particularly happy with how they are ranked. The Nuclear Threat Initiative released a report on a biannual basis, effectively assessing the risks each country faces, and Pakistan and India are both pretty near the bottom. I think the main problem is a lack of transparency.
Right.
So neither country really wants to talk about what they do for fear that may release more information to their rival in the region.
Right.
But we can't, may I jump in for a minute?
Sure.
But we also can't discount what has happened, for example, in Belgium. They had an insider at a civilian nuclear power plant. Now, that's not at all the same level as nuclear weapons being diverted. However, that's potential sabotage or for a plant, and we see what happens when plants go down from safety accidents. If you had a security accident, who knows what could happen?
Well, the United States stores missiles in Europe, and about 6 years ago, in 2010, there was a group called Bomb Spotters that actually walked into a warehouse where these weapons were, and they waited to be arrested. Nobody arrived.
Twice.
Oh, I shouldn't laugh. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean it's a real issue in terms of U.S. weapons stationed abroad,
right.
Both in the Netherlands and Belgium. It's a big concern.
Yeah.
There have been security incidents at both these sites, and again the level of disparity between how different countries protect nuclear weapons, even if they are U.S. nuclear weapons stationed abroad, is again another concern. And the military material aspect of this is something that really needs to be addressed. I mean, as Deborah mentioned, 83% of this material is military owned,
right.
And no one really wants to address that issue.
And that wasn't really addressed at the summit.
Tong, how concerned is China about those military weapons that are in places like India and Pakistan, and the fact that they're not as well looked after as they should be? That is, after all, Asia. That is China's neighborhood.
I think China is increasingly concerned about the situation in South Asia. Both India and Pakistan, have large amounts of both military and civilian nuclear and radiological materials scattered all over the countries. Both countries have a growing nuclear arsenal, and both countries face serious terrorist threat in general. We just saw this terrible hot test attack a few days ago, and over the past few years, even some heavily defended military bases in India and Pakistan were under attack from militant and terrorist groups in both India and Pakistan. So the combination of large numbers of military nuclear materials and the very high threat of terrorism really concern China. And both countries border China, and material stolen from India or Pakistan can be transferred across the borders into China and to be used in a Chinese attack. So I think China is increasingly concerned about the situation in South Asia.
Right, and we know that China has its own terrorism problem as well. Deborah, I want you to take a listen to the Director General of the IAEA, that's the UN nuclear watchdog. He's talked with one of our reporters earlier this week. Let's take a listen to what he said.
Until now, there has not been the terrorist attack using the nuclear material. But this fact should not blind us on the possibility of terrorists using nuclear material in the form of a dirty bomb, for example. So we should stay very vigilant. The possibility is real, a risk is there.
So there have been 4 nuclear security summits. What are the accomplishments so far? I mean, are we in a much safer place now?
A lot of nuclear material has been drawn down. A number of countries were celebrated at a lunch I was at yesterday for the fact that they've gotten rid of their material, and over the course of that. I don't think that would have happened without this. And also, as we were talking with the Chinese switching now and having fuel that can be for research reactors that can be with low enriched uranium, the ability to change out the 74 research reactors in the world that are using highly enriched uranium, that type of technological research and progress, I don't think would have happened. The drawdown of the material wouldn't have happened. So we are diminishing, at least in civilian control, the amounts of material available around the world. And I think that has really been helpful. And without having leaders focus on this, it wouldn't have. It's like having the Olympics. If you don't have the Olympics, maybe you won't run as fast, maybe you won't train as hard, and it needs to be paid attention to and celebrated, and that's what these summits have been about.
Right, and talking about where we go to from here, Matthew, nuclear security, as you have pointed out, has been very much the personal initiative of President Obama. What happens when he leaves office? Who picks up the mantle on nuclear security then?
It's a good question, and I think that's the main issue that's been facing this particular summit. I mean, if we look at it over the process of the 4 summits over the 6 years, I think undeniably it's been a success. But bear in mind that the Obama administration set out such huge, ambitious goals at the very beginning, locking down all fissile material, vulnerable fissile material around the world. That clearly hasn't happened. That was a huge ambition that just didn't occur. So yes, there is high-level awareness. Yes, 50-odd world leaders have been engaged in discussions about this topic. But, I mean, there's still a huge question over implementation and, as you say, the future. So, for example, the next US president may view this very differently, whoever that may be. And this is very much an Obama initiative and part of his presidential legacy. So the question of what happens next, where this debate will go, who will follow up and maintain this momentum is effectively the big question that's still hanging over this summit.
Does the powers of the IAEA, do they have to be expanded to make this some kind of permanent feature that we see perhaps every year or every 2 years?
Again, it depends on who you ask. There are many that think the IAEA, because of its experience in this field and its technical background, is the place for this to go. Others think that it's the issue, which is still in some areas controversial, shouldn't be taken to the IAEA because it will make the institute or the institution more politicized, right. And it broadens this debate out to a huge number of states. Bear in mind that there are only 50-odd represented here. When you look at the IAEA and the representation there are so many more perspectives and opinions coming in that the key message may get muddled slightly.
I was briefed by the White House before this and was at the summit today and yesterday, and what's planning to come out is that they want to look to 5 institutions to carry forward this work. The IAEA, the UN, Interpol, the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Nuclear Terrorism, and the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. Big names, what's going to happen? Actually, I think the most important thing that's going to happen is that the Sherpas, who are like the number 2s, the ones arranging it, there's an agreement, and I don't think if it's been announced yet, if it has, so much going on today, I haven't heard everything, but I know this is the plan, that they will meet annually at the sidelines of the IAEA's General Conference every year. So there will be a mechanism. So no matter who's in number 1 in the country, you have an agreement among the Sherpas to meet on the sidelines and keep this moving.
Should countries like the United States be setting the example there? Because when President Obama came to power, he talked about reducing the number of nuclear weapons, in fact, reducing overall all kinds of nuclear material around the world, but then announced that the United States is going to embark on a new mission to build more weapons. These are going to be tactical weapons. They're going to be smaller. Wasn't that a violation of the pledge to develop or not develop new weapons?
Well, we've always had TAC nukes, unfortunately, and we still have them.
But he's talking about a $1 trillion plan over the next 30 years.
Talk to Congress about that. That was a really hard pressure run. I don't think that he wanted that. I think It's a negotiation, and it's a shame. It's a really bad example to set to the rest of the world, and shame on Congress, and shame on President Obama to some extent for not pushing back harder on that one.
Okay. Tong, let's get back to Asia. Chinese officials have expressed concern over Japan's excessive stockpiles of nuclear materials. Now, at the Nuclear Security Summit, both Japan and the United States announced that all enriched uranium and plutonium has been removed from Japan. Is that going to solve the problem?
Well, that will certainly help, but Japan only returned the weapons-grade plutonium, which originated from the United States, to U.S. At the summit. And also, Japan still maintains a huge stockpile of reactor-grade plutonium, which in theory can also be used to build bombs. Japan also has uranium enrichment capability. It has a commercial enrichment plant. And given this huge fissile material stockpiled in Japan and under Japan possession, plus Japan has very advanced civilian rocket capability, which can be converted to a missile capability. And Japan has tested satellite retrieval technology, which is also similar to the warhead reentry vehicle that we need for a missile program. So given all these capabilities, plus the fact that multiple very senior Japanese former and existing officials have openly talked about the possibility of Japan going nuclear. So the combination of all these factors are concerning China.
Right. Another threat in Asia, and that is coming from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Tong. This is a country which many people in the world consider to be a failed state, and it has nuclear material. How concerned is China about this? And is the DPRK one of the weaker links in this chain of nuclear security?
Yes, I think North Korea is becoming an increasing threat to China. China is willing to implement very strict and comprehensive sanctions on North Korea. But we have to remember that we should not impose sanctions for the sake of imposing sanctions. We need to have an exit strategy to de-escalate the currently very high-level military tensions on the Korean Peninsula. We need to have we need to stick to the long-term objective of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, but that won't happen overnight. We need to work on near-term solutions. So I think a more realistic proposition for us to strive for is to reach an interim agreement with North Korea in which North Korea will freeze its nuclear and missile program. In return, the US and South Korea should suspend their joint military exercises. I think that will help create very badly needed confidence that will lead to more ambitious agreements to be reached in the future.
Debra, I want to read to you part of what the Chinese President Xi Jinping had to say at the summit. He said, "We must build international consensus on enhanced nuclear security, have zero tolerance for nuclear terrorism with no discrimination, push for the full implementation of the legal obligations and political commitments on nuclear security, and give an effective response to new challenges and threats." Talking there about international consensus. Russia was not there.
Well, the other thing that most people don't realize is that Russia and the United States have been cooperating along the way, even though they're officially not, Russia's not there. The U.S. has kept them briefed along the way, and they've been informally involved. Also, the Russia and the United States are chairing the global partnership against the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism for the next 5 years, I believe. So they're agreeing to do this because it's so important. And also, the Russians and the U.S. both made joint démarches, their ambassadors did, to the countries to get them to sign on to the CPPNM amendment that was discussed earlier. So there's that cooperation there. The thing that was really interesting, China had this huge exhibit in the expo. They had the biggest exhibit of anyone, and it was featuring their Center for Excellence. And in talking to the people who were there from China, they're excited about this. I think that China is, first of all, they have to develop their own civilian nuclear capability, and they want to standardize that and export it, and it'll become a major driver for them. So they are taking some leadership by having that new center where they're going to train others in Asia and are reaching out. So they're reaching out in a number of ways, which is good for them and I think good for the world. So I don't think it's wrong about the consensus. Even though we may squabble, you know, in front of people, everybody's behind fighting nuclear terrorism.
So Russia's in on what's being discussed here, but it's not here.
That's right.
Okay. Matthew, Reuters news agency is reporting that US experts are less concerned about militants, especially those in organizations like Islamic State, obtaining nuclear weapons than thefts of ingredients that could make what we call a dirty bomb. How can that be monitored? How does one prevent terrorists getting hold of stuff like that?
I mean, this is another one of the huge challenges that the summit process faces. Fissile material, so the nuclear material that is generally used to make a nuclear weapon, there's less of it. It's not used as widely. Therefore, it is technically slightly easier to control. Radiological sources are used widely in hospitals, industry, a huge number of uses for these sources. And so it's very, very difficult to try and control them. They're more portable, they're easier to handle. And so the idea of trying to develop a dirty bomb where these sources are combined with conventional explosives is a seriously worrying one, just because it's much easier to get your hands on them. I guess the slight positive is that the effects of a dirty bomb compared to a full fissioning nuclear weapon are nowhere near as severe, but it's still the more likely risk that we're facing, whether that be in Europe or the US or wherever.
Okay. Tong, what do you think China's feelings would be on the fact that much of what was talked about here in Washington will now be legally binding?
Well, I think that's a major problem we are facing here, because countries have different perceptions about what's the best way to promote nuclear security. Some Western countries really want to see a legally binding, universally adopted nuclear security standard, and they also call for mandatory progress evaluation mechanism and a mandatory peer review mechanism to be built into future global nuclear security architecture. But some countries feel that different countries are facing different nuclear security threats. They have different types of nuclear or radiological materials on their soil. They face different terrorist threats. So I think China might fall into the second category.
Right.
And we also see that from President Xi Jinping's statement today, he mentioned, we should respect the sovereignty. Here, I think that indicates that China has some reservations about this legally binding convention.